Morning, church. It's good to be back with you, although I'm not 100%. I'm fighting a upper respiratory infection. Told some of you it's like bad luggage. I can't get rid of it. But I am still, I'm going to hopefully work through it today, and hopefully I can speak loud enough so that you all can hear me. As I mentioned, it's good to be back with you. I appreciate the men that filled in for me last week in my absence. And we are continuing in the book of Matthew. We left off a few weeks ago before we had our guest speaker, Joe Wells, in Matthew chapter 19, verses 1 through 12. And then last week, as I noted, I wasn't here. So this morning we moved back into our passage about, or our section that we're covering in Matthew. And we get today to verses 13 through 15 of Matthew chapter 19. Appreciate Jay reading that for us so that we have it. I hope you'll turn your Bibles there. It's not a lot of verses, but I do want to point out some things from these verses that I think are important. And I've titled this lesson, Jesus and the Children. I wonder if it was purposeful that Matthew, immediately after talking about the importance of marriage, that he now moves into the area about children. And if you remember in Matthew chapter 19, 1 through 12, Jesus is addressed about marriage and divorce, and he expresses the importance of marriage and what is an authorized marriage and what is not an authorized marriage. And then here in verse 13, the verse that immediately precedes that conversation, we have this conversation about children. So after discussing God's plan for marriage, Jesus will discuss children, or I guess we should say the account that takes place will be addressing children. And in this context, as we look at it, Jesus is going to point out that children have something that every person needs in order to inherit eternal life. So that's one of the items that we look at. But as we look at this encounter that takes place, I want us to focus on three examples related to children that I think are important. And I do want to say this before I move to each of those points this morning. I will be addressing parents and grandparents. I will be addressing members of the church. I will be addressing teenagers. And shall I say it this way, I will be addressing all of you. So please don't tune out because I say for a moment now parents and grandparents, or I say for a moment now church, or I say for a moment now teens, because I think all of this has some application to us. The first example related to children that is important is that Jesus, or we see in this account what takes place, is the children are brought to Jesus. Look at verse 13 of chapter 19. It says there, then some children were brought to him so that he might lay hands on them. I've titled this first point, Bring the Children. The Greek word here translated for children is often the word that's used for infants and toddlers. In fact, if you go to Luke's account in Luke chapter, I don't remember the chapter now, but Luke's account of this same incident, Luke actually says there, bringing even their babies. And so what we see here is an account in which parents are bringing their children to Jesus. It was a tradition in the Old Testament for prophets and such to lay their hands on children and pronounce a blessing. In fact, you might remember that this is exactly what Jacob did. Jacob, as you remember, God would change his name to Israel, right? And his sons and grandchildren would make up the 12 tribes of Israel. And as in Genesis chapter 48, verses 14 and 15 there, as Jacob is with Joseph's sons, Jacob's grandchildren, he lays his hands on them and pronounces a blessing. So this wasn't uncommon to occur, and it appears that there was a tradition during Jesus' day in which the children would be brought to the rabbis or the teachers, and the teacher or the rabbi would lay their hands on that child and pronounce a blessing. And that appears to being taken place here. So here we have parents, presumably, that are bringing their children to Jesus for the purposes of receiving a blessing. Bring your children. Let me address parents and grandparents for a moment. Now you're here this morning, and that's commendable. So please don't answer this question with, yes, I'm here this morning, because I am talking about more than just being here this morning. The question is this, parents, grandparents. Are you bringing your children to Jesus? What are you teaching your children that is the most important thing in life? Are you teaching them that it's the college that you go to? The job that you get? Marrying the right spouse? Or are you teaching them that Jesus in their life is the most important thing? Parents and grandparents, are you more focused on events that are taking place outside of the church, or on events that are spiritually minded events? Can I speak bluntly for a moment? You might say, well, you just did, but more bluntly? If I were to ask your kids or grandkids the question, what they thought you were teaching them was most important, what would they say? What grade would they give you if we were to evaluate what you're teaching your kids is most important in life? Would it be an A or an F or somewhere in between? What spiritual grade would they give you? It's important that the children are brought to Jesus. It's important that they're here at services. But to be honest with you, we have many more things that go on besides our worship at 10. Did you bring your children to Bible class this morning? Did you bring your children to Wednesday night Bible class? Last week, or 2 weeks ago, the elders had brought a man out who's very experienced in youth-related activities, or I shouldn't say activities, youth-related spiritual things. And so the elders decided to bring this man out, and we had a 2-day youth event. Did you bring your kids to the youth event? Please don't take this the wrong way. One of those days, not one of our youth was present. Not one. What's more important in their life? Are you bringing your children to Jesus? Church, let me address you. Because, yes, it's the parents' responsibility to be the spiritual guide for their children. It's the elders' responsibility to put in place certain activities or events or lectureships or spiritual meetings that are a benefit not only to the children, but to all the membership as well. But as a church, we also have a responsibility to the children. We have to be ready. Just because you don't have a child or grandchild that may be present, we have to be ready to help serve these children and help serve these parents. To help them to bring their children to Jesus and show their children what is really important in this life. To help to give them the spiritual guidance that's needed so that they will be successful. Some of you remember the Joy Bus program. You remember the Joy Bus program? Only like 10 of you, that's it? Must not have had any joy in Vegas or wherever you came from. When I was a young man, a few years ago, the church where I attended in California, we had a Joy Bus program. We had 8 buses that would go out, and every Sunday they'd pick up kids and families and they'd bring them into the worship assembly, and we had 150 different people that would be there for worship on a Sunday. And it was nice. You'd see the auditorium was full and you had all these kids and it was great. The problem was it wasn't sustained. The problem was we didn't help church, the family, the parents, the grandparents. We didn't help them to be prepared to deal with the spirituality of their kids. And parents and grandparents weren't really invested. They said, I'll let the church do the work of raising my kids spiritually. And unfortunately, I think the result of that is we have a lot of people that were a part of that program that are not faithful today. Bring your children to church. Bring your children to Jesus. Not just church, but to Jesus. Share with them the importance of what's really important in this life, their spiritual life rather than their physical life. Point number 2. Second example related to children that is important. Jesus says, do not hinder the children. Look at verses 13 and 14. It says, then some children were brought to him so they might lay hands on them and pray. Disciples rebuked them, but Jesus said, let the children alone and do not hinder them from coming to me. Do not hinder the children. Now it appears based on the Greek word that's used here that they are continuing to bring children to Jesus. And it appears they have interrupted the conversation that Jesus was having with his disciples about marriage, divorce, and remarriage. So perhaps the disciples are frustrated. They're not getting the responses they need, or they continue to be interrupted. And so they essentially rebuke these parents for bringing the children to Jesus. And Jesus says, do not hinder them. Think about this for a moment. Here are the disciples of Jesus attempting to hinder children from coming to Jesus. Not some atheist at the college. Not some neighbor that doesn't believe in God or some bad influence that your teen may hang out with. The people that were closest to Jesus, the disciples, were hindering the children from coming to him. And Jesus says, don't hinder the children. Let me speak to everyone for a moment. As we noted in Matthew 19, the parents are here bringing their children to Jesus, and it's the disciples, the religiously minded, if you will, that are actually hindering them from coming. Are we hindering children from coming to Jesus? Are we hindering them perhaps by our actions or inactions? Are we hindering them perhaps because we have no interaction with them whatsoever? Are we hindering them because we don't encourage them? We could take this question and we could go very broad with this point in this question, but the point is we, the church, need to make sure that we are not doing things to hinder parents and anyone, grandparents, from bringing their children to Jesus. Children are mimics. They mimic adults. I've shared with some of the parents and grandparents here before that I think it's a bad idea for you, if you're leaving the church building, to be in the car with your kids and grandkids and begin to criticize the leadership of the church or someone in particular in the church or even the preacher. Don't do that. Criticize the preacher. It's not that I can't take the criticism, but I want you to understand that when you do that in front of your children, you are telling them something. And you have to be careful that by your actions, you're not hindering children from coming to Jesus. How many Christian teens do we have in here? Let me see your hands. Get them up. Let me see your hands. Come on. You're not a teen, Latoya. I didn't say teen at heart. Teens, are you hindering the children from coming to Jesus? By your actions? By the things that they see you do in their presence? Are you hindering the children from coming to Jesus by your lack of attendance? By demonstrating to them that there's something more important than spiritual needs? A video game, hanging out with your friends, whatever it might be. Teens, these little children that you see around here, they look up to you. They watch you. They see you. Don't hinder them from coming to Jesus by your action or lack of action. All right, I'm sorry I have to do this, but parents and grandparents, I'm really not trying to beat you up today. I'm really not. But you need to think about where our priorities are with our children. It doesn't say, don't hinder your children from going to college. It doesn't say, don't hinder your children from getting a good job. It doesn't say, don't hinder your children from earning a lot of money. It says, don't hinder your children from coming to Jesus. Where are we placing our priorities? Because if your priority, it's not a guarantee that if you as a parent or grandparent do everything right, that your children or grandchildren are going to be faithful. But we can say with some amount of certainty, if you do it wrong, they have a better chance of not being faithful. And I know there are members here today in this congregation who regret things they did as a parent or grandparent in reference to their children today because their children they're not spiritually minded. They're not faithful. And certainly we could go back, and if we could change some things, we would, but we can't do that. But here's what we can do. We can all learn from those mistakes, and we can help our children to understand what is most important. Don't hinder the children from coming to Jesus. Point number 3. The third example related to children that is important is you must become like children. Notice again verse 14. Jesus says this, let the children alone, do not hinder them from coming to me, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as these. We have to become like little children if we're going to be a part of that kingdom of heaven. There are some characteristics that children have that ultimately every person that will stand before the Lord in judgment and be saved on the judgment day will have, that belong to children. Mark chapter 10 says, and there, truly I say to you, who does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will not enter it at all. Luke says something similar there in verse 18. Whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child will never enter it. There are characteristics about children that are necessary for salvation. And Jesus is saying you must have these characteristics that children possess if you want to enter into the kingdom, to God's eternal kingdom. What are these characteristics that children have that we should have in order to enter into the kingdom? Now, let me pause for a moment because I want to make sure that I'm clear as I say this and what Jesus is saying and explain it properly, that there's more to being a Christian than just getting in the waters of baptism. There are characteristics that are necessary for you to exhibit and have, that children have, that are a part of God's kingdom. And so we have to evaluate whether we have those characteristics or not, because if we don't have them, we will not enter into that eternal kingdom. Paul would share with us something I think is very important in 1 Corinthians 14:20. He's actually saying it directly to the Christians that are there in Corinth. And he says this, listen now, brothers, Do not be like children in your thinking. Rather, in evil, be infants, but in your thinking, be mature. What is Paul saying? He's saying as far as our thinking process, our logical thinking process, we shouldn't be like children. Children don't think logically about things. But he makes a point there that I think is very important about children. He says, in regards to evil, be like infants. In regards to evil, be like infants or like children. Demonstrate childlike goodness. Think about childlike goodness. They don't envy. Some of your parents are going to disagree with this one, but they don't strife, although they do with their siblings. They're not normally angry. They have short memories when they're wronged. They don't hold a grudge. Here's a popular one that we all do. They don't apply ill motives to things. Children are not vindictive. We as Christians need to take on characteristics that are like children in regards to those things. Yes, our thinking ought to be mature like adults, but our actions, especially in the area of evil, ought to be like children, not carrying these ill motives. Now, if you were here last Sunday night, we had question and answer, and I struggled through it with my voice again, but I went ahead and did question and answer on Sunday night. And one of the questions was about Calvinism. And if you're not familiar with Calvinism, it is a doctrine taught by John Calvin, essentially popular in our society today, began around the 16th century. And ultimately, John Calvin came up with these, what are referred to as the 5 tenets of Calvinism. And the very first tenet of Calvinism is total depravity. And if you don't know what that means, and by the way, I want to share with you, the majority of the majority of churches that exist in our world today hold to at least one tenet of Calvinism. And many of them hold this tenet of Calvinism. Here it is, total depravity. It goes like this. You were born in sin, and there's nothing you can do to change that. I gave a quote on Sunday night from a well-known Calvinist who said, "You think that baby's cute? That's a viper in a diaper." He went on to say, same Calvinist, God made them so cute and so small so they wouldn't kill you. He made them so small so they wouldn't kill you. He made them so cute so you wouldn't kill them. Calvinism, along with Catholicism, believes in what's known as the original sin. When you're born with sin. You are not righteous. You are not good. You carry the sin of mankind on you, and you are in need of redemption. But I want you to notice in Matthew chapter 19, that's not what Jesus says. He says the kingdom of heaven are made up of these vipers and diapers. Not born in sin, not born to be evil, as Paul says there in 1 Corinthians 14, be in your thinking, or be in evil, be like infants. Now, we're not going to go into all the detail about the original sin and why it's false or whatever, but I want you to recognize how just that minor point contradicts to what Jesus says in Matthew chapter 19 and what we're talking about in regards to children. Because Jesus says, as Christians, we have to have the characteristics of these little children in order to even enter into the kingdom of heaven. We have to adopt these childlike qualities and characteristics in order to be saved. Jesus and children. This is the second time if you remember that in the book of Matthew, Jesus has had an interaction with children. And in both cases, he shares the importance of the relationship that he has with children. And it's important that we understand that relationship as well. If we're going to be Christ-like, that we take on the same type of characteristics. Let me conclude with this. So we look at Matthew chapter 19, 13 through 15. Let me emphasize to parents and grandparents again, bring your children to Jesus. Demonstrate to them what's most important in this life. Show them by your actions what's most important. I'll share with you a little story. As a freshman in high school, I went out for the track team. And I used to be a little skinnier. 105 pounds as a freshman in high school. Shadow of my old self. I ran distance, and in the first event that I ran, they moved me up to varsity because I could run really far, really fast. And they had events that took place on Wednesday nights. And they were grooming me to be the next long distance runner for track. In fact, I, as a freshman, qualified for state of California. I was the 5th in varsity running as a freshman in high school. But my parents would not let me go to the track meet on Wednesday night because there's a Wednesday night Bible class that goes on. Wasn't happy with my parents at the time, but they taught me a valuable lesson about really what's important in life. Parents, teach your children, grandparents, teach your children what is really important in life. Because if you don't, they're going to find something that's more important than Jesus. Which gets me to point number 2. Don't hinder the children from coming to Jesus. That's a message not only for the parents and grandparents, but for all of us. If you're a member of this congregation, you need to be involved in the lives of the children that are here in this congregation. Involved in their lives in some way. Encourage them. Share with them the importance of what it is to be a faithful Christian. Be an example to them. And finally, if we're going to be those that are going to enter into the kingdom of heaven, we need to take on the characteristics of a child. And the things that are evil and the challenges that we face in life when we're wronged and we apply ill motives to people and we don't solve those problems, we create hostility within the church. We leave bad examples for the children that observe it, and we create a situation where perhaps we put our eternity at risk. Become like little children. Those grudges you have, put them away. Those things where that member wronged you, forget about it. Be like children. Take on those characteristics. And what we see is an example of Jesus and children demonstrating the importance of the kingdom. And it demonstrates to us that we ought to understand the importance of those things in our churches today. This morning, the invitation is offered. If you haven't become a Christian, if you haven't taken the steps of salvation, you haven't taken the first step to become childlike, that humble attitude that's ready to obey. If you're already a Christian, perhaps you need the prayers of the church or some other encouragement, or you need to make some public confession of sin. Whatever need you have, I encourage you now to respond as together we stand and sing.